so happy to be in your parish because I have had email contacts with Father Anthony for several years, and finally we happen to meet in person today, and it's a great happiness for me also to know his charming wife and all the family, and also some other priests of this parish, and now to meet some of the young people, because Father asked me to speak about theology, theological dialogues, and I said, Father, don't you think that this is a bit difficult for the youth? But at the same time, I think we have to be well informed, and maybe sometimes we don't have enough pedagogy to speak about this topic, and I shall try my best to explain things as simply as possible. But I think before we speak of the theological dialogue between the so-called Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, I would like to say something about the history of the ancient Christian communities in the Middle East and in Ethiopia. And so, as Father said, the Eastern Orthodox include not only the Russians, the Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians. You see, there's 16 churches altogether, patriarchates and churches. On the side of the Oriental Orthodox, we have, of course, the Copts of Egypt, the Ethiopian Church, which was under the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate until 1959, when it became what we call an autocephalous, that is, independent church. Then, you know, when Eritrea became an independent country, they also wanted to have their own patriarch and patriarchate. Then about the Syrian Orthodox, well, they are from the tradition of Antioch, and we shall say more about them. And then you have also a Syriac-speaking, well, Syriac tradition, let's say, in India, in the south western coast of India, called the Malabar coast. And then, of course, the Armenians. It's, in fact, today, the only Christians in the Middle East. Well, it's not, it's a bit further than just the Middle East, but they are the only ones to have their own country, Armenia, which has had also a difficult history because of the first great empires from the time of the first empires at the beginning of Christianity. First they had the Roman Empire on one side and the Persian Empire, then fighting each other, and these Christians of the Syriac and Armenian traditions, in fact, were just in between. And later, the Romans were replaced by the Byzantines, and again, you know, the great powers were fighting each other. With always these difficulties, in fact, for all these Christians of the Middle East, to remain Christians, first of all, after the rise of Islam from the 7th century, and until today, because, you know, with the changes of the borders, many of these communities have had difficulties in even keeping in touch. I take the example of the Syrian Orthodox. So today they have their patriarchate seat in Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. Tonight we have some Syrian Orthodox who are originally from Homs and Hasakeh in Syria, and another one from Midyat in southeastern Turkey. So at least under the Ottoman Empire, there were no borders because it was a large empire, but with the modern borders, the Syrian Orthodox who were living in, let's say, in the north of Syria had difficulties to go to Turkey, and as you know, it was impossible for them to go to Iraq for many years. And so you had cousins maybe 50 kilometers away, and you were not able to have contacts, direct contacts, or to go, you could not go and visit them. So I think it's important to understand that, well, again, under the Byzantine Empire, no border, you know, and or under the Roman Empire. So we have to see the positive sides of being a Christian under a large empire, because at least there were facilities of traveling. And also, I think it's always interesting to put together history and geography. For instance, when I speak of the Church of Alexandria, people don't connect church history with the gospel, for instance. So maybe they know that St. Mark has written a book of the Gospels, but maybe they don't know that he's considered by the Copts as the first bishop of Alexandria. So I think we should always, when we see names of places, when we read the Bible and when we read the Gospel, to check on a map of the time of at the beginning of Christianity, to check where were these places and to check where they are today. If we speak of Tur Abdin, maybe you never heard this name, but this was the place of the patriarchate of the Syrian Orthodox Church since the end of the 13th century. And they remained there until the 1915 genocide. You have heard, I think, about it, when many Christians were massacred and had to flee away from their homes. So we hear more about the Armenian genocide, but you should know that Christians of Syriac traditions, unfortunately, they had to go through the same massacre. And I mean, all these people now, you can find them all around the world, so they are not any longer only communities of the Middle East, but because we are here in a context of what we call diaspora, this is your chance to meet all these ancient Christian communities now here in Ethiopia. So you know that you have many Coptic Orthodox parishes, but you do have also Syrian Orthodox parishes around Australia. You have one bishop, I met him yesterday, the day before, here in Sydney. You have an Armenian bishop also in Sydney. So I think it will be nice in the future that you can organize meetings with youth of all these churches which are what we call sister churches of the Coptic Orthodox Church. And now I understood you also have some Ethiopian Orthodox parishes and even some communities from Indian Orthodox background. So you see, step by step, you have all these ancient Christians represented here in Australia. And the same happens in North and South America, as well as, of course, in Europe and also in Africa. The beginning of the Ethiopian Church, of the history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is quite interesting because the first bishop of the Ethiopian church was not an Ethiopian. He was coming from Tyre, which is today a town in Lebanon, and his name was Frumentius. He traveled with his brother and uncle, who was a trader, and they wrecked in the Red Sea, and they were brought to Aksum, which was the capital of the Ethiopian kingdom of that time, and these two brothers were Christian, so they evangelized the court, and Frumentius then went to Alexandria, was ordained consecrated as a bishop, and went back, and he was the first bishop of Ethiopia. So you see, God has many ways. It's not always a person of the country which is going to begin the history of a certain church. And what many people ignore is that, in fact, the Ethiopian church is the first church of Black Africa. So, you know, because the Protestant, Catholic and Protestant missionaries, they came to Africa very much later, you know, when you had these colonial powers in Africa. But I always notice that when I speak about this first Christianity of Black Africa in Ethiopia, the Africans are always very interested, you know, to hear about this history. And so we have some people here who have an Ethiopian background, so I'm sure we can discuss more about it. Of course, the Coptic Church is also an African church, you know, having the seat first in Alexandria before it was moved to Cairo. But the Egyptians were always more connected to the Middle East than to Africa itself. So, of course, they had many contacts with the Byzantine, the Greek Orthodox, if you prefer, but, you know, we cannot discuss here of the word Byzantine, because they were not all Greeks and they're of Greek background, so we should be more elaborate when we give names. Now I try to simplify all this. And so, of course, Alexandria used, as you know, to be a very great city. Not only it was like New York and London today, we can say, because of the trade, because of the culture, because of the school of Alexandria, and the other really great theological school of the early Christianity was in Antioch. So who knows today? We still know where is Alexandria, but do we know where Antioch is? We see the name of Antioch, of course, in the Gospel, because this is the place where the Christians were given the name of Christians for the first time. And so today it's a tiny town in the southeastern part of Turkey. And, well, it has lost all its glory. But if you read about the church history, of course, you will see the name of Antioch many times. And it was also the place of departure for the caravans, for the trading caravans, crossing the desert, going through Homs. I said one person here is originally, her family is from Homs, you know, and going east, going even crossing what is called today Central Asia, and, well, that's another history, the history of the Church of the East. They followed what we call the Silk Road, crossing Central Asia, the northwestern part of China today, and they arrived as missionaries as soon as 635 in Peking, in China. That is 1,000 years before the first Catholic missionaries. So maybe you have never heard of this history, but I think it is a very interesting history. And these missionaries were the same who were the first missionaries in India, in fact, with St. Thomas, the apostle. So you see, we speak of apostolic churches, that is related to the first apostles and disciples of Christ. And all these churches, of course, they try to maintain their tradition, to maintain their liturgies, to maintain their languages as much as possible. They say that when Armenians move out of their region, and in fact, the Armenians are known as famous traders, so they have traveled a lot. They went to Persia, they went to India, they went to many places in Europe, I mean, along the centuries. And the first thing that the Armenians were doing was to build a church and to build a school, because then you could manage to keep the language, to teach the language to the children, and to keep it until today. So you see, this is why it's so important, like what you are doing here, is not only to have the church, but the schools always play a very important role in Christianity. Then maybe we should say something more about the Armenians, because they have not only, they have different heads to rule their church. Of course, the main Catholicos, which is equivalent to Patriarch, is now in Echmiadzin, near Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. Then you have another Catholicos who used to have his seat in Cilicia in southeastern Turkey, but they moved out with this 1915 genocide, and now they have their seat in Antelias, which is just north of Beirut. They have one patriarch in Jerusalem, and one more patriarch in Istanbul, Patriarch of Constantinople, Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople, because under the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople was responsible for all the Rum Orthodox, as you call them in Arabic, that is, today we call them Eastern Orthodox, in the Ottoman Empire. And the Armenian Patriarchate was created, yes, to take care not only of the Armenians, but also of other Oriental churches existing in the Ottoman Empire. So you see, it's a very rich history. We cannot come into details. I am ready, of course, to answer any question, but I think it's interesting, first of all, to see that we have these different churches, ancient churches, with different liturgical texts, you know. So maybe if you read translations of these liturgical texts of the Coptic, Ethiopian, Armenian, Syrian Orthodox, of the Greek Orthodox tradition, the words are not the same, but you will see that the pattern, the succession of the times during the liturgy are similar. And of course, you should first study what is similar, and then go into the details in order to understand what is similar or somehow specific to a tradition. And I would say that the next step is to read it with spiritual eyes and to understand that if you read not only the liturgical texts of all these traditions, I repeat, Coptic, Ethiopian, Syriac, Armenian, and Greek, you will be really enriched, you know, by these readings, which are available today in English. You can also find texts on internet for free, you know, But it's not only through the liturgical texts that your spiritual life may be enriched, but also with other texts, like in monastic life, you see, when these monks were writing about their experience, you know, either in a monastery or as a hermit living in isolated places, in some caves, which you can still see if you visit some countries. And so, of course, I remember visiting in the, near the Fayoum some caves which were digged, well, I mean, it was a little wadi, and they were, these caves, which were a little high in the wadi, were filled with sand, you know. But when the archaeologists came at the end of the 20th century, they took out all the sand, and then you could see the cave as it was left by the monks, you know. And we could even find some tools used by the monks for their work. For instance, I remember a little piece of leather, you know, to make a shoe, with the tool to cut the leather. And you could sit on this kind of bench used by the monk, where the hermits themselves were sitting centuries ago. And I think there is nothing more wonderful than, again, to relate some readings about these Coptic monks, you know, and to be in the places where they used to live. So I think it's also very interesting to read books about Christian archaeology, about the ancient monasteries, and then when you visit these places, either in Egypt or in the Middle East, I think it gives really a rich impact, you know, to your reading, because, or if you go to some monasteries, of course, in Wadi Natrun and elsewhere in Egypt, if you go to Turabdin, we have somebody from Turabdin with us that is in southeastern Turkey today. They still have about 12 monasteries which are active, and which is a kind of miracle, because this was really the heart. As I said, the Patriarchate had the seats there until the 1915 genocide. But so many Syrian Orthodox were living in Turabdin, and today they have only about 1,000 people left in Turabdin, which is of course very little, you know. So it's, if ever you happen to go to Turkey, please take some time and visit the Turabdin area. And now, you know, for the last years, it was very difficult to visit Iraq and Syria, but you also have ancient monasteries that you can visit in these two countries. And in fact, in Syria, we have north of Damascus, about 40 kilometers, a monastery called Musa el-Habashi, that is Moses the Black, and they say that it was an Ethiopian priest who happened to be a monk there, you know, in the Middle Ages. And it's one of the ancient Syrian Orthodox monasteries which you can visit in Syria today, which was taken over by the Syria Catholic in the 19th century, but the history goes back, of course, to the Syrian Orthodox. And in Iraq, you have the famous monastery of Marmata, St. Matthew, who, in fact, you know, was in the zone near Mosul, which was very attacked by these ISIS fighting in the last years. And so, well, many, yes, there are not so many churches left, but of course some ancient churches were bombed and unfortunately disappeared forever. Anyway, so you see, I spoke of linking history, geography. I am adding archaeology because I like it, but I think it's also part of this historical study, let's say. We can also make some liturgical discoveries through reading all these texts, or, as I said, texts of the monastic tradition. And then we have the different languages, you know. So, as you know, you have Coptic for Egypt, but then from the Middle Ages, Arabic was more used than Coptic. And it was the same with the Syrian Orthodox. They have many texts in Syriac, but also in Arabic from the time of the Middle Ages. For the Armenians, well, it's the Armenian language, and in Ethiopia, the ancient language is called Ge'ez, which is related to the main language of Ethiopia today called Amharic. So you see, maybe some of you will have a special interest for such or such community or tradition, church tradition. Maybe some of you will study Coptic, Arabic, Christian, Armenian, Syriac. We don't know. In India, of course, today they still pray a little bit in Syriac, but they also mostly pray in Malayalam, which is the local language of southwestern India. So you see, we have many ways and many ways of studying, of having different interests about these Oriental churches. About the Byzantine tradition, now maybe we switch to theology. Why do we have today this separation between the so-called Eastern Orthodox, I repeat, who are today the Greeks, the Russians, Romanians, Serbs, etc., and the Oriental Orthodox, the Copts, Ethiopians, Syrian Orthodox, and Armenians, plus the Eritrea and India? Well, in 451, they gathered a council in a place called Chalcedon, which is just, you know, in Istanbul, you have the Bosphorus, which is separating, which is some water separating Turkey itself in the east and a small part of Turkey which is on the west side of the Bosphorus. So Constantinople is on the west side and Chalcedon is just on the other side. So they had this council or meeting, if you prefer, of bishops of different churches, and they discussed about Christology, what do they believe, who Christ is, you know, and because they had many discussions and fights also about the terminology, how to express the divinity and humanity of Christ. And in the first centuries, they had several meetings. They had meetings before that in Nicaea and Constantinople, but that they elaborated what we call the creed, you know, because they had to express the Christian faith in an orthodox way, with an orthodox vocabulary, which was Greek at the time, because it was like English today. So, in fact, the Greek language did not always help, because like in Syriac, you know, the terminology was different, and that created also some schisms or separations. So what happened in Chalcedon? They used a new terminology, speaking of the humanity and divinity of Christ. They spoke of two natures, which you can accept at the logical level. But, and the Greek word is physeis. It's physis when it's singular, and physeis when the word is plural. So, this created a tension, especially with the Christians of Egypt, the Copts of today, and the Syriac-speaking Christians. Because they said, well, we don't like this new terminology, because speaking of Christ having two natures, there is a risk, you see, of separating the humanity and the divinity in Christ. And they said, we don't accept your new terminology or names. We remain faithful to Cyril of Alexandria. He is our father. We follow, his explanation about who Christ is or about Christology. And what was the main expression of Cyril of Alexandria? I say this in Greek and translate it into English. He spoke of miaphysis. So you see, you have this Greek word physis, and I don't translate it for the time being. So miaphysis, one physis. And then, that was the problem. Later on, when the separation took place, they were labeled, the Christians who followed that terminology, as monophysite, because they thought that they believe only in one nature, one physis. But the terminology of Cyril is much more complex, because he speaks of miaphysis, one physis, of God the Word, which is to speak of his divinity, and Sesarkomeni in Greek, incarnate, to speak of the humanity of Christ. And this is why you should never speak only of miaphysis, but to keep the whole sentence, one physis of God the Word incarnate. Then you keep a balance, and you understand very well that Cyril speaks of the divinity and of the humanity of Christ. And when he says one physis, it's a composite, if you want, composite physis of divinity and humanity. And in Chalcedon, if you speak only of two physis or two natures, you could be considered as heretic, because you have to include that these two natures of physis are in one person, you see? And then again you find a balance. So this is what the theologians of the two families of churches, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, have discussed, especially since 1964, when the non-official dialogue began in Geneva, in fact, in my home place. And this dialogue became official in 1985. And there were two presidents for that, co-presidents for this official dialogue. One is, until now, Amba Bishoy of Damiette, the Bishop of Damiette of the Coptic Orthodox Church, who represents all the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches. And the other one was Metropolitan Damaskinos, who was at the time, I say was because he passed away, and was the Greek Orthodox Bishop Metropolitan of Switzerland, and was my bishop in Geneva. So you see, that's how I was very close when the meetings took place in my own place, and I from that time I followed up, the steps of the dialogue. You see, for instance, so they gave some Christological statements to say that we have a misunderstanding, as I tried to explain. I can explain again if it's not clear for some of you, that in fact, before Chalcedon, with your Oriental Orthodox churches, and after Chalcedon, in fact, they all do believe that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man, without separation and without mixture. And if we agree on that, it's clear that we have the same faith in Christ, and we solve our problems, and we could be united. And there are many reasons that can explain that we have several misunderstandings. For instance, I heard many times that the Oriental Orthodox have no icons because they are monophysite, and it's just the contrary, because in all the Oriental Orthodox churches, you see either icons or wall paintings or illuminations, that is, pictures in manuscripts, showing Christ represented as a man. If these churches were real monophysite, if, you know, that is for monophysite Eutyches, who was the father of monophysism, you know, for him the humanity of Christ was swallowed by his divinity, then for these people the humanity of Christ is not important, and if you were monophysite, you would never represent Christ as a man on any picture or painting. So this is one point. Then if you read all these liturgical texts of all these Oriental Orthodox traditions, you will see that they repeat again and again. You know very well in the texts of your Coptic church that they speak of Jesus Christ being fully God, fully man, without separation, without mixture. You find these exact words. You speak of the Theotokos being the mother of God, etc. So I think now it's great time, and the most important argument, of course, is that the Rome Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox, they do have Saint Cyril as a church father, as you do, you know. So once we agree on this, already just with this, we should settle the whole matter and the whole main misunderstanding. Anyway, now, you know, we have to go step by step. I think we have to study carefully all these original texts written by Saint Cyril, written by Severus of Antioch, Dioscoros of Alexandria, and other church fathers. We have to study the texts of our liturgies, etc. And then I think it's very easy to find out that our faith is similar between the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. But of course, it requires time, it requires reading, studying, you know, and who is ready to do all this reading and studying? Well, I hope that some of you will take time at least to study a few texts.